Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled, Take Control of Your Clinical Study, Visualize Site and CRO Performance to Improve Governance. My name is Margot, and I'll be your X-Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, with time for a question and answer session with our speaker. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speaker throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. At this point, I'd like to thank Cortesian, who helped develop the content for this presentation. Cortesian, headquartered in Princeton, New Jersey, was founded in 2003. Their goal provides clinical data your way to every client. They pride themselves on flexibility, responsiveness, and adherence to client specifications and timelines for every project, whether it may be conducted. They have worked with more than 160 pharmaceutical biotechnologies and medical device companies with 100% repeat business. Cortesian's business model unites domestic and offshore staff with minimum overhead and maximum efficiencies within a framework of validated computer systems and industry best practices. Your results: high quality, cost effectiveness, faster turnaround time, and therapeutic expertise to support your study. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's event, Joe Baracchio. Joe Baracchio brings over 15 years of leadership experience in the life sciences industry, overseeing multidisciplinary cross-functional teams, including clinical operations, product management, data management, biometrics, and regulatory affairs. Joe is currently a portfolio manager at Cortesian, and he provides senior-level management guidance and support to project teams involved in clinical data management, biometrics, and medical writing activities. Prior to joining Cortesian in 2014, Joe worked with WCCT Global to drive the company's growth into a full-service contract research organization. Joe holds a master's degree in applied biostatistics and epidemiology from the University of Southern California and a bachelor's degree in biology from the California University of Long Beach. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to our speaker. You may begin whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, Margot. Let me just share my screen.
No worries. Perfect.
All right, is my screen showing?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, great. So the topic of our webinar today is how to take control of your clinical data by leveraging data visualization and central monitoring. So in today's webinar, we'll go through some of the challenges sponsors have when tracking the performance of their clinical studies. And our learning objectives are: one, to identify the data you need to track sites and CRO performance. So I'll touch on how we implement central monitoring and data visualizations to help you better manage vendor performance. Second, what kind of data visuals help easily identify trouble spots? So in the second segment of this webinar, I'll provide some examples of visualizations that help you more easily see areas of risk in your study. And for the last two learning objectives, I'll run through an example case study that illustrates how you can leverage these reports to improve vendor management and avoid the pitfalls that other sponsors may have run into with their studies. So a little bit on Cortesian's central monitoring services. We believe that our central monitoring services enable sponsors to more effectively manage the performance of their studies. And to set the stage for the content that I'll be covering over the next few slides, I presented here a brief schematic diagram of our central monitoring solution. Our first step is to perform a risk assessment, also known as what we call the RACT assessment for the study. And based on this assessment, we then implement the three components of our central monitoring solution. And these are key risk indicator and central monitoring analytics, central data review, and integrated site support. Now, with the implementation of this risk assessment and the appropriate technology tools, our central monitoring team will review the data and summarize the observations into reports. And this is what we term the central monitoring output. Now, the resulting reports are the Integrated Monitoring Insights Report and Study Insights Report, which I'll go into a little more detail about in a later slide. And before we dive further into this discussion, this is just a brief schematic diagram on our governance model at Cortesian. So at the bottom of the diagram, we have our study level communications between Cortesian's project and central monitoring teams, liaising together with the study or program manager at the sponsor or CRO end. And if any issues need to be escalated, the internal teams communicate with their point of escalation. At Cortesian, that would be our chief operating officer, and for the sponsor or CRO end, it may be the head of clinical development. All right, so diving now into how we establish a central monitoring strategy for a clinical study. Our goals are fourfold. First, we identify and reduce risk before study start. 2, we detect risk by monitoring the right data. 3, we respond with consistent and effective action. And 4, we adjust by evaluating effectiveness and adapting to the needs of the study. Okay, so our first goal to implementing an effective central monitoring strategy is to identify and reduce our areas of risk before starting the study. And the way that we do this at Cortesian is by performing a retrospective risk analysis on data from past studies of an equivalent or similar nature to the relevant study. And performing this exercise enables us to gain insights on risk profiles and be able to make data-driven decisions. Okay, so in this example, we took data from a dermatology indication where we aggregated data from 11 past studies, and it included data from 104 investigator sites. And this result led us to identify 14 key risk indicators, or what we term KRI for short. This table presents the 14 KRIs that we observed as being important based on our risk analysis. And of these, the top 5 KRIs we found where site performance was poorest in our analysis were AE underreporting, rate of AEs, IP DOSI compliance, subject dropout rates. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a dermatology study, and rounding out our top 5 KRIs was rate of queries issued on data related to lesion counts. So when planning for future clinical trials in this particular indication, we may want to consider paying close attention to these 5 KRIs and develop mechanisms and systems where we can proactively and consistently monitor these high-risk KRIs. And similarly, this exercise allowed us to identify 11 other KRIs, which are considered as medium and low risk, and may also be considered of importance for monitoring and tracking the study. So what are some of the benefits of performing a retrospective risk analysis? Well, it provides one, a holistic picture of past study performance, and this allows us to identify where our areas of improvement can be and proactively mitigate the risks for future studies. And it also helps study teams make sound decisions for future clinical studies when developing their protocols. 2, it allows us to create an organization-level performance benchmark for assessing investigator site quality, and this empowers study teams to be able to make data-driven decisions when performing their site selections. And 3, allows us to offer therapeutic specific risk assessments across multiple historical studies performed within a given indication. So one point I think that's worth mentioning here is that while studies do gain an earlier benefit from a retrospective analysis when implemented during the protocol and study planning stage, it's never too late to do this even after the protocol has already been written or the clinical study is already active. And in this latter scenario, you'll still be able to gain insight into the risk areas for your study that may need to be more closely monitored, especially if we find that historical data indicates that these are known issues. So we just reviewed how retrospective analysis of past study data can assist in protocol and study planning. And so now we present an example of how we use our observations from the retrospective analysis to detect the risk in a live study and monitor the right data. Here we've taken the 14 KRIs that we identified from a retrospective analysis and applied them to a dermatology study of the same indication. And this study, we're enrolling 820 subjects across 12 sites. Our overall study risk status tells us that 10 sites are medium risk and 1 site is high risk and 1 site is low risk. So in this table, our overall summary of KRI frequencies for the 14 KRIs that we identified as important for this type of dermatology study. And the numbers inside the bars represent the numbers of sites falling within a given color indicator. So for example, the KRI duplicate or partial data match, we see that there are 10 sites in amber color. And we use the Mahalanobis distance formula to identify anomalies of duplicate or partial match data. And I'll explain a little more about Mahalanobis distance in the next slide if you're unfamiliar with this. Similarly, we see that there are 4 sites in the study that are consistently performing study visits on Sunday. And this too is driven by a statistical formula that we implemented in our programming specs. So at a quick glance, the study team can see which KRIs are resulting in the most issues. And the clinical study team can then further investigate into the potential issues or causes of these issues and make adjustments to study conduct and management as necessary. One point worth mentioning here is that not all risks may be actionable issues. These risk summaries are intended only to alert the study team of potential issues that exist, but not all need to be investigated. If the need arises during the course of the study, it is possible to titrate the risk thresholds up or down so that the study team isn't alerted to react every time. Okay, so continuing what we were discussing on the previous slide on detecting risk by monitoring the right data, this heat map provides a comprehensive view of all KRIs and their status at each individual site. You can see the overall, or the site's overall risk score. This is a statistically driven formula as well that gives each KRI a weight towards the site's overall risk score. And we find here that 1 site each were found low and high risk, whereas the rest of the sites are amber or medium risk. I mentioned in the last slide that we looked at identifying potential data anomalies using a statistically driven formula called Mahalanobis distance. And this is simply the distance between 2 data sets. When the distance is 0, this means that the data is a 100% match. The further away from 0 the data is, it means that there's only partial data matching. And in this example, we looked at vital signs data. So we see here at site 6 that subjects 1853 and 1982 both have a 100% match of their vital sign measurements at the baseline visit. And notice that the Mahalanobis distance is 0. At this same site, subjects 1948 and 1991 are a partial data match, wherein all the baseline data matches except for the systolic blood pressure. And so it brings to question whether these are the same subject or perhaps the data was just incorrectly entered. The point here is that with the implementation of statistical monitoring, we're able to identify these trends, which could have been missed by source data verification alone by on-site monitoring. In this next example, we again demonstrate the application of statistical monitoring methods and how this was used to identify subject visits performed on Sundays. And you may wonder why this is worth noting. So our experience has shown that relatively simple dermatology studies such as this one are often conducted with subject visits performed on weekdays, so we generally don't expect visits to be performed on weekends, let alone on a Sunday. Earlier, when we performed our retrospective analysis, we found that 14 out of 104 sites were performing Sunday visits, which is roughly 13% of all sites. But in this study, we found that 4 out of 12, or 33%, are performing Sunday visits, and this is higher than we expected. Look, especially at site 12 that has 92 visits performed on Sundays. Again, this may in fact be that the sites are truly operating on weekends, but it's worth investigating considering that our retrospective data suggests differently. The key point again is to investigate when the data appears to be suspicious. So the goal of central monitoring is to respond with consistent and effective action, and this is our central monitor's responsibility. So what exactly is their role? Well, our central monitor's role goes beyond just data cleaning. It's also their responsibility to perform holistic reviews of the study data. And they may do this using a number of different tools and systems. That may include EDC, CTMS, IWRS, clinical labs, central monitoring softwares, ETMS systems. And our central monitor will then summarize and report their observations into two distinct reports. The first report we call a study insight report, or SIR for short. And the purpose of the SIR is to provide the study team with performance metrics at the study level. This enables the study team to identify trends and patterns in the data, and also helps them to make data-driven decisions for the study as a whole. And our second report we call an Integrated Monitoring Insight Report, or IMIR for short. This report provides summary information at the individual site level. While we provide this report to the study team as well, this report is really more beneficial for the CRAs because it gives them insight into the risks and or activities occurring at the site. So it should help them better plan their on-site visit and allow them to give more focus where it's needed when they're on site. So in this slide here, we simply present examples of how our insights reports look. All the data is summarized into a hyperlinked Excel report where you can simply click on tabs to view the report that you're interested in. The main takeaway of the slide is to show you the ease of which the clinical study teams are presented with the risk summary. So there's no need for you to have to learn all of the technology tools that are involved in the implementation of central monitoring. We're more than willing to train you on the technology, but our team will do all the data diving and summarize the observations in the easy to view reports. All right, so the last component of implementing an effective central monitoring strategy is to adjust. And this is done by evaluating the effectiveness of your strategy and adapting to the needs of the study. So we've covered central monitoring and how it's used to evaluate study risks. As a quick recap, our central monitoring team reviews the various technology tools available and assesses risk at the study and site level and report their observations into reports. So in this example, we'll take a look at how we use the central monitoring team's observations to optimize site monitoring activities. So in this example study, it consists of 35 investigator sites. And at a quick glance, we can see that there are 7 sites in red that need closer oversight. And so the study team may consider increasing the frequency of monitoring to these red sites and reduce the frequency of visits to the green sites. So it's important to consider how actions may impact quality. So for example, we may have prior working history with a green site that has a proven capacity to perform at high quality with minimal oversight. So in this case, it might be okay to reduce the frequency of on-site monitoring. Whereas on the other hand, there may be a green site that we just started working with and is performing well because the CRA's level of involvement with the site. So in this case, you may not want to reduce the monitoring frequency. Otherwise, we risk the possibility of dropping the site's performance. So when making adjustments to the monitoring strategy, it's always important for the study managers to seek input for their team members, especially the CRAs. And when actions are taken, study teams should be aware to continue to evaluate the effectiveness of any changes that were made and continue to adapt or change with the strategy as needed. And one more point worth mentioning here is that changing the frequency of monitoring doesn't necessarily mean it's overall reduction in the number of visits for the study. Sometimes it's just a rebalancing of visits and putting resources where they're most needed. So again, this is just one example of how our central monitoring team identified risks in the clinical monitoring activities and suggested adjustments to the on-site visit scheduling. But this type of assessment can really be applied similarly across other areas of study management, including third-party vendor data and even being able to observe product efficacy during the course of a study for either a blinded or unblinded trial. So Margot, we have a poll question next.
Yes, thank you. That brings us to our first polling question for today's webinar. What is your biggest concern about central monitoring technology? Please select one of the following. The technology is too expensive, takes too long to implement, We don't understand how to use or implement the technology, or my organization does not think it is necessary. I'll give the audience a couple more moments to select one of the following answers. And our question for today is, what is your biggest concern about central monitoring technology? It looks like most of the audience has voted, so I'll be sharing these answers. 47% of the audience voted the technology is too expensive. 27% of the audience voted we don't understand how to use or implement the technology. 13% voted takes too long to implement, and another 13% voted my organization does not think it is necessary. So on that note, I'll hand it back to our speaker, Joe Baracchio.
All right, thanks, Margot. Okay, so we've covered how we implement a central monitoring strategy. And to recap, we, one, identify and reduce our study risks by performing a retrospective risk analysis on data from past studies. We then detect our risks by monitoring the right data and tracking the KRIs based on our retrospective analysis. We then respond with consistent and effective action when KRI thresholds are met, and we evaluate the effectiveness of study conduct and management activities and adapt to the needs of the study. So let's now take a look at some example visualizations to show you how these visualizations truly help simplify how you view your clinical data. Okay, this is one example visual to easily see the level of risk associated with individual investigator sites in the study. Here we have all of our participating sites listed, and we're tracking their enrollment performance as well as their risks for protocol deviations, screen failures, subject dropouts, numbers of open queries, and AE rates. As an example, you can see here that site 110 has high enrollment, but also has a higher than average screen failure count. Likewise, they have a high risk of protocol deviations and a high number of open queries in the database. For this reason, the number of risks associated with this investigator site, our central monitoring team may deem this as a potentially high-risk site, and the clinical study team may take this information and consider adjusting their governance or oversight of this particular site. On the other hand, we have a site like Site 105 who appears to have no risk for our selected KRIs. So this could be an indicator that the clinical team can consider diverting their time or resources to another investigator site that has a higher risk or need for oversight. Okay, in this next example, we're looking at the enrollment characteristics of the study. In the top left diagram, we see the rate of screen failures across all sites. And you can easily see that Site 110 has a higher than average count of screen failures in the study. I mentioned in the previous slide that this site was deemed to be a high-risk site. And one of the reasons for this is because they exceeded our threshold for the acceptable number of screen failures, as you can see by that dotted green line, which represents our threshold. In the bottom left diagram, we see the rate of randomization across the study. Sites 115 and 122 are our highest enrolling sites. So we may want to look into what they're doing particularly well and share these successes with other lesser enrolling sites. This could also be a signal to increase the monitoring review of subjects at these sites, considering the volume of patients enrolling, and this could potentially skew the final results of the study. And in the far right diagram, we're looking at the geographic distribution of enrollment. We find here that sites located in the South Atlantic region are successfully enrolling high numbers of subjects. If for whatever reason enrollment is struggling, you can perhaps consider identifying and including additional investigator sites within this region to help promote enrollment. Okay, so here we take a look at subjects disposition data, particularly looking at the gender distribution of enrollment across the study. We see here that there's roughly 72% of all subjects enrolled in the study are females. This may or may not be an issue, but some sponsors may be more keen on having a more equal distribution of gender enrollment. On this far right diagram, we see the activity status of subjects in the study. Blue represents whether the subject has completed the study. Green is whether they're currently active in the treatment phase of the study. Red is their screen failures, and yellow means that they were prematurely discontinued. And you can quickly see here that all the screen failures in the study are female, none are male. Similarly, only males in the study have been prematurely discontinued. So this prompts the question, why is it that only males are early terminating from the study, but not any females? So this would be something worthy of further investigation. Just a quick comment, as a sponsor, you'd be able to easily customize these specifications to your interest. So for example, if you are particularly interested in seeing gender enrollment by site, you'd be able to simply do that from your desk without having to reach out to one of our programmers to configure it for you. Okay, so safety is another important metric to track in the study. So you want to have a visual for monitoring adverse events. In the left diagram, we're looking at the number of AEs reported by site. And we see that site 114 has an abnormally high occurrence of AEs being reported. And this is highly suspect because the site is not a high enroller. And it's possible that they're over-reporting AEs. So in this situation, it may be worth the sponsor or medical monitor intervening to better understand what the circumstances are around these AE reports. On the right hand diagram, we see counts of individual types of AEs. And this gives us a quick snapshot of all the AEs reported in the study. And you can potentially make inferences as to whether the safety profile of the investigational product is consistent with what's expected. Protocol deviations are also important to track. So in this visual, we see a large number of deviations being reported for the category of missed doses. What we found in this particular example was that the deviations were resulting from diary entry errors. So there was an issue with the configuration of the e-diary as well as the training of the patients. So the results of this was a follow-up action was needed with the e-diary vendor. There was retraining of the investigator at that site that was required, as well as more thorough training of the enrolled patients. These are a few diagrams showing site performance relative to queries. Specifically here, we're looking at the total count of queries for each site across the study, count of open queries requiring site response, and count of open queries requiring the data manager or CRA's review and closure. These are fairly straightforward visuals, so I don't have too much to comment about these, but again, the takeaway from seeing all this is that with these example visuals is that the simplicity of which you can see trends and act accordingly based on any areas of risk that you see. In this table, we present the source data verification activities of each CRA in the study. So we measured the average number of forms they're reviewing per on-site visit day, the minimum and maximum number of forms they reviewed in an on-site visit day, as well as we're tracking the total number of on-site visit days that they've conducted. So in descending order from the top, we see the CRAs with the most to least number of CRF pages reviewed and SDV'd. This is just a diagrammatic presentation of the data that was shown in the previous table. Again, we see in a quick snapshot in bar graph format the performance of each CRA with respect to their review of the source data and CRFs. Sponsors have found this to be particularly useful as it allows them to quickly see how their monitoring CRO is performing. And they can see the workload of the CRAs, enabling them to just make informed decisions about how to optimize monitoring visits for their study. Margot, this brings us to our next poll question.
That's right. Today's poll question is, what is the most frustrating thing about getting status reports from your vendors? Please select one of the following: not enough detail, too much detail / unable to interpret reports, not supplied on time or with enough frequency, or lastly, change order to generate the report. Please select one of the following. I'll give the audience a couple more moments just to get in their answers. Perfect, and I'll be sharing these answers for what is the most frustrating thing about getting status reports from your vendors. 40% of our audience voted not supplied on time or with enough frequency. 33% voted too much detail or unable to interpret reports, with 20% voting not enough detail and 7% reporting change order to generate the report. And on that note, I'll take it back to the webinar.
Thanks, Mario. Okay, so we've covered how to implement a central monitoring solution, and we provided some examples of visualizations that are used to monitor study performance. So what we're going to do now is present a brief case study where the sponsor elected not to implement central monitoring at the start of the study, but then decided midway through the study that they did want to implement it. So this case study will demonstrate how data visualization and central monitoring were able to help the sponsor regain control of their clinical data. Okay, so our case study is based on a phase 3 ophthalmology study that enrolled 480 subjects across 21 investigator sites. Now, this study started in December 2017, and we implemented central monitoring in July 2018. We concluded our central monitoring activities in November and closed out the study in December 2018. So through the course of the central monitoring implementation, we provided weekly reports to the sponsor. And I should also note that Cortesian was completely independent from the monitoring CRO in this study. So in this visual, we're looking at the data entry activities at the sites, plotted in blue, and source data verification activities of the CRA shown in orange. At the start of central monitoring, we can see that the sites were doing well to keep up to date with their data entry activities. You'll see here that 94% of the data had been entered for all enrolled subjects at that time. On the other hand, only 19% of the entered data had been source data verified at that same point in time. So prior to the implementation of our central monitoring, the sponsor had been unaware that there was a backlog of source data for review. Their expectation was that the monitoring CRO was adequately scheduling on-site visits based on the enrollment activities. So they just assumed that the SDV activities would be in line with the data entry activities. Now, having this information presented to them in this simple visual, the sponsor was able to quickly see that there was a disparity in the data activities. And so they immediately took action with the monitoring CRO to have them start working more closely with the sites to review and clean the data. Over time, you can see that the investigator sites continue to maintain consistent and keeping up to date with their data entry activities. But you'll see here that it took nearly 3 months around the end of October, early November, before the CRAs were even able to get within 50% of the required source data verification activities. And this delay in source data review had a cascading impact on the data. In this visual, we're presenting query aging metrics over time, and the color codes represent the query response times. Red represents query response times exceeding 25 days from the date of when the query was first issued. Amber is response times between 10 to 25 days, and green is response times less than 10 days. The dotted line represents the start of our central monitoring implementation, and you can quickly see here that before we implemented central monitoring, the query response time was greater than 25 days on average, whereas after implementing central monitoring, there's a vast improvement where queries were now being resolved within 10 days of issuance on average. So by sending weekly query aging reports to the sponsor, it helped control the query response times. This is another visual of the query aging metric. The orange bars are before the implementation of central monitoring, and the green bars are after its implementation. Again, you can clearly see the improvement in query response times after the implementation of central monitoring. From the day the query was issued, the average number of days to receive a response was reduced from 15 to 8 days. On the back end, queries were being closed within 4 days as opposed to 9 days. And lastly, we were able to reduce the time of opening of queries to its closure from 7 to 4 days on average. And this is roughly 50% improvement in query management. So I mentioned earlier that the delay in data review had a cascading impact on the data, and this included protocol deviations. At the start of our central monitoring efforts, we took an average of protocol deviations reported across all sites and plotted it in a diagram shown here. The green dotted line represents the average of all deviations reported, and we calculated this to be approximately 1.1 deviations per subject. Now, as you can see, there are a couple outliers here which respond to sites 101 and 102, who are averaging approximately 3.1 and 3.2 deviations per enrolled subject. So in seeing this, it alerted the sponsor to further investigate into why these sites were reporting more than the average number of protocol deviations. So a little bit more on protocol deviation. So at the end of the study, we plotted the average rate of major and minor protocol deviations. The average of reported minor deviations remained steady throughout the study at around 1 deviation per subject. This is shown by the orange plots. But we can see from the blue plots that the average of major reported deviations decreased steadily between the start of our central monitoring efforts from 1.1 deviations per subject to 0.3 deviations per subject by study closure. So this visual provides a quick snapshot of how the implementation of central monitoring data visualizations help to better manage and reduce major protocol deviations. So a couple of slides ago, I had mentioned that there were 2 sites who, at the time when we first implemented central monitoring, were reporting greater than average numbers of deviations per subject relative to the other sites. After further investigating into this, we found that one of the sites had a high number of minor protocol deviations. This wasn't too problematic for the sponsor, although some retraining with the site was required. But we did discover that the other site, which was site number 101, had clearly been violating the protocol. So when I first introduced this case study, I had mentioned that there was a backlog of data review by the CRAs, and Site 101 was no exception. So at the next monitoring visit to the site, the CRA discovered that during the data review that the investigator had been administering a prohibited medication to his patients on study. Now, in the investigator's opinion, he felt that the ConMed shouldn't be considered a prohibited med because he generally administers it as part of his standard of care. However, after additional discussions with the sponsor and medical monitor, it was fully agreed that the ConMed was indeed considered prohibited. We can see from this visual the timing of this discovery because we see a sudden spike in the count of prohibited meds, 48 in total. As a result of this finding, all of the patients enrolled at Site 101 at that point in time and had already been administered the prohibited medication were deemed ineligible for the per protocol population. By this point, only 15 of the patients were prematurely discontinued, and the rest had fully completed the study. This visual shows the reasons for discontinuations in the study. 24% of the subjects that were prematurely discontinued were discontinued due to AEs. 22% were discontinued due to worsening of their condition. And we can also see that 22% of subjects who used a prohibited medication were discontinued. And we know now that from these cases, these were the subjects from Site 101 that were administering the prohibited medication by the investigator. Okay, so this visual measures the performance of our key risk indicators over time. So in concordance with the sponsor's assessment of risk for this study, we set the risk threshold to 60%. And that means that for the pre-selected KRIs we chose to follow for the study, 60% of those KRIs should remain in green. At the start of our central monitoring implementation at the end of July, we were below 60%. But by early September, we were able to maintain a level of quality above the threshold and consistently maintain this until study closure, when 73% of all KRIs were in green, 14% in amber, and 13% in red. So just to summarize what we learned from our case study, so based on retrospective data taken from our past studies, we introduced KRIs to manage the quality of study through data visualization and central monitoring. And at the start of our implementation, the data was telling us that we were below our acceptable level of quality. And so our central monitoring team was tasked to identify the areas of risk needing to be addressed. And what we identified was a delay in the source data verification activities, which in turn led to discoveries in protocol deviation and the administration of prohibited medications. So we can assert that with the implementation of data visualization and central monitoring, it helped the sponsor identify these risk areas and further mitigate them. They were able to better manage and control their clinical data, and ultimately, they were successfully able to meet their study objectives. So this brings us near the conclusion of our webinar. Hopefully you found the information covered today to be helpful and insightful. And just to wrap up, how can Cortesian help implement central monitoring and data visualization solutions for your organization? Well, we always take a proactive, process-driven approach with focus on quality and consistency. We offer a cost-effective solution that won't break your study budgets. We also have fast implementation timelines. We can develop a solution for you in as little as 8 to 12 weeks, as compared to other organizations who I've heard will estimate as much as 6 months or longer. And last but not least, we have a dedicated team of experts that have worked in this space for many years, and we'll work closely with your organization to develop a customized plan that is best suited for your study. So thank you for joining our webinar today. And Margot, I believe we'll do some Q&A now.
Yes, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Now I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions and comments using the question window for the Q&A portion of this webinar. I've already received a few, so we'll start with those. Is Cortesian Central Monitoring Solution technology dependent?
Yes, so Cortesian's solution is technology dependent on software, but we have a robust team with experience to build systems within a multitude of different platforms, so it can be customized to each customer's specifications.
Interesting. Our next question is, can a technology-naive company adopt Cortesian Central Monitoring Solution?
Yeah, so any customer that's interested in our central monitoring solution should find it easy to adopt. There's really little to no technology experience or background required. We'll guide you through every step of the implementation and provide training to the technology if that's required.
Thank you. And our next question is, as a sponsor, do I need to hire an analytics expert to implement your central monitoring solution?
No, we have our team of experts on staff that will guide you through every step of the implementation.
And that brings us to our next audience question. Can I conduct a risk assessment if my study has already started?
Well, there's a greater benefit to implementing a strategy from the beginning, but it's never too late to implement it mid-study, as we demonstrated by our case study.
Our next question is, how involved should the sponsor be in implementing central monitoring technology?
So we require the sponsor's involvement in identifying the risk areas, but in terms of technology, we will handle all of that. So we just work with the sponsor to identify the key risk indicators that are most relevant for their study.
And that brings us to our next audience question. How quick and scalable is Cortesian's central monitoring solution?
So I mentioned in the last slide that we can do it in as little as 8 to 12 weeks. If we have already conducted a retrospective analysis on study data from a similar indication in the past, then we may be able to reduce that timeline. But we'll work with each individual client to determine the best possible timeline for implementing their solution.
Thank you for that answer. That brings us to our next question. Many of your KRIs are highly correlated with one another, so are essentially conducting the same risk twice. How do you correct this?
We have a KRI bank or a list of which we select and develop KRIs for the study. So we do this in collaboration with the sponsor before we implement it. But we do provide our recommendations to select KRIs based on their study and availability of the data, so we can see that we don't have KRIs of a similar nature.
All right, thank you for that answer. This is another audience question that has to do with a slide. On the central monitoring transparency slide showing the data entry versus monitoring activity, was this SDV or SDR? If SDR, how was this tracked? And if not, was it a targeted SDV study or 100% SDV?
It was 100% SDB.
Perfect. That brings us to our next audience question. Do you track site risk over time to show red sites coming back into green over time to assess if your action taken is having a desired effect?
We do trend analysis of site performance over time of study conduct, and we, along with that, will identify KRIs which is impacting the overall site risk.
All right, and that brings us to our next question. What is the platform you use to perform centralized monitoring? Does it integrate with homegrown CRO systems?
We're currently using Spotfire, and yes, it can be integrated with many different systems, but we would evaluate that on a case to case.
Our next question from audience member is, can you perform analytics across metrics that are not EDC driven? Closure of action times, monitoring visit performance, TMI filling, for example?
Yes, as long as we have access to all the data.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. We've reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. If you have further questions, please direct them to the email address now showing on your screen. Please feel free to share the recorded version of this webinar with your friends and colleagues using the link attached in your chat box. Thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now please join us in thanking our speaker, Joe Baracchio. We hope you found this conference informative, and have a great day, everyone.